There is hope on the horizon, and that hope is coming from our friends in the north. The Truth Recovery panel that's been set up there to investigate mother and baby homes has been sitting for some time. It has been designed with a specific human rights lens. It's a very different way of doing business to what we did down here with the Mother and Baby Homes Commission, some of the egregious flaws in which were just outlined to you by Maeve. So we're delighted to have with us today Wesley, Geddis and Joy Carey from PRONI, the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, and they are going to be chaired by Dr. Leanne McCormick, Professor Leanne McCormick of Ulster University, who with her friend and colleague Elaine Farrell is one of the authors of Bad Bridgets, a book I can recommend to you all about the misdemeanours and bad behaviour of Irish women in America in the 19th and 20th centuries. And they got up to all sorts of remarkable things. But more importantly for today, Leanne is the co-chair of the Independent Truth Recovery Panel in Northern Ireland, and thus responsible for the ideological and philosophical underpinning for that whole process. But we're very pleased, as I say, to have two actual archivists with us this afternoon to describe their process. Leanne, would you come to the podium, please?
Thanks very much, Katrina, for the introduction. And it is a delight to be able to introduce Wesley Geddis and Joy Carey, and to be able to have the opportunity to speak about the situation in Northern Ireland. As Katrina said, I'm the co-chair with Sean O'Connell of the Truth Recovery Independent Panel, which is looking at mother and baby institutions, Magdalene laundries, workhouses and practices and pathways. So just a small amount that we have to look at. And Wesley and Joy are part of the Truth Recovery Records programme. As part of my role in particular with Mark Farrell, who's here today, we work on records and archives and work very closely with the project team at PRONI. Just to say about the independent panel as well, we are the output of the Truth Design panel, which Maeve was part of, and I would encourage you to go on and you can see their fabulous report and their recommendations online as well. And they have a very innovative and original recommendations to approach truth recovery, of which an independent panel is to feed into a public inquiry. And they recommended as well who should be on that independent panel. And those members were appointed from a public appointments procedure we started our work in April 2023. So we've just had a year through. Our interim report has just been published, and that's online for you to look at as well. But just to say briefly, there are 10 members. We've covered trauma-informed practice, sociology of discrimination and gender-based violence, archives, genealogy, human rights and domestic law, social and oral history. And very importantly, and one of the key unique aspects of the independent panel as well, is that we have 3 victims and survivors in the panel who bring both their lived experience but also their wider professional experience to the work of the panel as well. And as I said, the project team, the archive team working in PRONI are genuinely a delight to work with. They're a fabulous team who have real passion and real genuine care for what they're doing and for the records that they're doing, and an awareness of those victims and survivors of whose records they have, the ability, and what will happen to those at the end. And all of those are things that they will talk more about in the discussions that are ongoing and the procedures there. So without further ado, I'll let you hear from Wesley and Joy.
I'll just make a note of that. Delight to work with. Okay. So thank you all. Thank you, Katrina, and the committee for inviting Joy and myself to talk to you today. And before I begin the presentation, it's just to say that through this presentation, we will seek to give an overview of what PRONI has done to assist the Truth Recovery Panel in its work to examine mother and baby institutions and other related organisations. So, as the official archive for Northern Ireland, we have considerable experience of working with very sensitive personal information, whether that be with mother baby institutions, or indeed troubles related court records and inquest files. So we have a lot of knowledge and experience there working with very sensitive data and handling access to information requests. So we recognise that this is a very sensitive topic for everyone here today, and it's to advise that PRONI's role really as the National Archive is to ensure that the records that we're looking at and dealing with are protected and preserved. That's our role in this project, and to ensure that those records are available not only for those who are living today, but are made available in whatever form that will be for future generations. So to secure that information is key. I just want to mention briefly about the term victims and survivors. I'll be referring to that term, and Joy will be as well in her presentation. And we're using that simply in the absence of any agreed terminology. And it's not there to say this is what PRONI thinks. It's just a term we have to use for today's purposes. So we're not here to offend anybody or upset anybody. It's just a term we have to employ as to make sure that people know who we're talking about, really. The other thing I want to just mention before we start is the point that Maria had raised in her presentation about access to information, and that is key to all of this, from PRONI's perspective, certainly. We have a firm position on not refusing requests under the Freedom of Information Act under the cost exemption. So if a person applies to information to PRONI and they can identify what they want to see, and it's clear that that can be pinpointed, whether it's a file 1,000 pages long or 10,000 pages long, we will not refuse that request under the cost exemption. That doesn't fly in the face or fit well with our other colleagues in other departments who do refuse that and make that excuse, but we think it's not right on a moral level to refuse someone access to information, because we are the last port of call, and if we say no, well, no one will see it, and we don't think that's the right position to adopt. PRONI also can only access information, or through PRONI, through the Freedom UK FOI Act, and obviously the Data Protection Act for subject access requests. So whilst both are useful, they're a blunt tool for those looking at this information and seeking information. So there will be a need for further legislation down the line, but certainly we're hamstrung in what we can do for people at this point. And again, on all of those things about not prohibiting disclosure in terms of the cost exemption, we have been in contact with the ICO, the UK Information Commissioner, to advise that whilst we may not meet our statutory deadlines of 30 days to respond to an FOI request, we believe it's better to be late with that response rather than to refuse it. So that's our position, just so that you're all aware, and those will hopefully clarify your thoughts as we move through the presentation. So, PRONI, this will be 15 slides long. It's not too long, hopefully, for you all to keep alert. The Record Office employs 70 staff, 70 permanent full-time staff, and a further 30 staff then are agency staff working on various projects for us. We hold 3 million records, and again, we are now into the digital age, and we have acquired almost 250,000 electronic records, and that will be a tidal wave that will come just the next few years, with millions of records due to transfer in the next 5 to 10 years. So our physical holdings will be dwarfed by our electronic in about 10 years' time. Under the Records Act, so we're subject to the Public Records Act 1923, and as Jerry Slater used to say, it was a breathtaking, achievement for the legal people at that time to draw up such a wonderful but vague piece of legislation, and that allows PRONI to take in not only records of government under Section 3, the public records created by Northern Ireland public bodies and public departments and so on, but also then to acquire, if possible, records from private sources. And that will include the religious orders, charitable organisations and so on under Section 5 of the legislation. So it's not a mandatory requirement under Section 5 for the private, but it's optional and allows us to take those in and preserve them. How did PRONI get involved in the Truth Recovery Panel's work, or to support this work? Well, you'll have heard from Maeve, and that was a fantastic presentation. Maeve, the Truth Acknowledgement and Accountability Report, which was published in 2021 from the Truth Recovery Design Panel, recommended 5 key points to look at. One of those you'll see there is access to records and access to information. No one at that point in 2021 was sort of pinpointed to look after that element, but it was put forward as a clear recommendation. And the point further in the report was about to ensure the immediate gathering and cataloguing of records should be carried out as soon as possible, pending a future public inquiry. So with that in mind, as Maeve said in her presentation, the Assembly, before it collapsed in 2022, passed its final act to introduce this piece of legislation, which again ensures that record holders should have a statutory obligation not to destroy, alter, or damage in any way records that they're holding, and not to remove those records from the Northern Ireland jurisdiction. That's quite key, but it didn't change the status of those records. They're still privately owned, if you like, records, and there's no actual right of access yet to those records, other than through the organisation concerned. That, in a way, was the Assembly drawing a line in the sand saying these records are secure and future work will be required to look at this again. So then, through our work with the Executive Office, who is overseeing, that's the Government Department of Northern Ireland, which is not our department, or the Department for Communities, but the Executive Office had worked with PRONI on other schemes, such as the Historical Institutional Abuse Redress Scheme and the Victims Payment Board Scheme, which is looking at payments to people who were affected by troubles-related incidents and had permanent disablements as a result. So through that, they then asked PRONI to look at the access to records strand of the design panel's report, not number 4. So then PRONI came forward. PRONI was asked to, which Joy will talk about, to carry out a full survey of all the records held by religious orders, charities and so on that pertain to mother and baby institutions and other related organisations. So Joy will talk about this and how that actual project itself has come to pass. So I'll pass over to Joy.
Good afternoon, everybody. So yes, just continuing on from what Wesley has told you already about the project. There were records held by 7 non-statutory organisations surveyed during phase 1 of our archive project, including religious orders, charitable organisations, adoption societies and church groups, and they hold records for institutions that were identified through the work of Professors McCormick, Leanne, who introduced us earlier, and Sean O'Connell in their Department of Health commissioned report of 2021. So the aim of that survey was to determine if the organisations were compliant with the new Preservation of Documents Act, and it also acts as a useful record for us of what archival material was declared as being in existence at that time. So the survey revealed that in excess of 4,500 individual items were held across those 7 organisations. A 4-month pilot project ran then from July to November of last year to see how many of the 4,500 records could be accessed and preserved by ourselves, either through deposit of the original documents or through digitisation and preservation of digital surrogates. The strategy for acquiring records made use of a provision in our primary legislation which enables the accession of privately owned records. However, historic private records are usually offered to PRONI voluntarily, Instead, with this project, it required us to initiate that transaction, being proactive and persuasive, and building rapport and gaining the trust of the record holders. In these initial conversations, I relied heavily on the new Preservation of Documents Act and the survey data. Being aware of the mostly non-archival standard storage environments, the frequency of handling and the resultant at-risk condition of many of the records enabled us to draw up a list of preservation recommendations for each of those organisations. For the record holders to comply more fully with their responsibilities under the Act, we offered our professional assistance by way of free cataloguing and digitisation services. Plus, conservation work was offered, also free of charge, to a few of the organisations whose records required it. For example, the Nazareth House Register, which you can see in this photograph. We would supply them with a full digital copy of their archive and would retain a copy ourselves. Our copy would be permanently preserved and would enable future access for the coming inquiry and for redress purposes. The records would remain closed and any request for access would be referred back to the record holder to respond to. The truth investigation and role of the independent panel was also explained in these conversations, including the panel research team's expectations for access to the information as well. As well as working out this plan of action, an operational team was established at PRONI to enable cataloguing and digitisation to begin as soon as records were acquired. So for the face-to-face negotiations with the record holders, the preference was to hold those meetings on site at PRONI, inviting record holders into the archive and by providing them with a tour of our environmentally controlled repository, our conservation and our digitisation studios. This let them see firsthand the professionalism and the care for records that's demonstrated by the whole team. I firmly believe that this helped enormously in their understanding that such records shouldn't be handled and stored like standard office documents, but as unique and historically significant, and they require the care and preservation found in an archive environment in order to endure. PRONI's experience and very solid reputation in managing records of a highly sensitive personal nature was also reassuring for them and for their legal representatives. PRONI staff have worked for many years with Troubles-related records and more recently in providing information to the Historic Institutional Abuse Inquiry and the Victims Payment Board Redress Scheme. In this piece of work, the key to building trust and gaining the cooperation of the organisations involved actively listening, allaying their concerns, being open and transparent about what we as archivists and what the wider Truth Recovery programme were trying to achieve. That involved remaining impartial and professional, even when discussions became more challenging. The Civil Service core values of integrity, honesty, objectivity, and impartiality really mattered to me in these conversations, along with upholding the professional code of ethics of the Archives and Records Association. If agreement could be reached, then options for the practical operational side of the work were discussed, and deposit agreement documentation was prepared. 4 operational processing options were offered, and to date, all 4 have been taken up. For example, the Church of Ireland Library digitise records themselves to our specifications. They have their own equipment to do so, and they provided us with the digital copies, while one of the voluntary adoption agencies, which has inherited records which date back to the late 19th century for one particular institution, decided that they'd rather the records were safely stored at PRONI permanently. We've also purchased a portable digitisation equipment, which allows imaging to take place on the record holder's premises, so they can A, continue to access records for their own business need during the imaging process, and B, keep an eye on what we're doing if they feel more comfortable with that. As you can see from the list of records acquired during the pilot, the results were positive and they surpassed expectations. In the case of the Nazareth records, 50% more records than were surveyed were actually received for processing. This included the records for Fawn in Donegal and Sligo, where Northern Irish citizens had been resident. During phase 2, the team expanded from 2 to 6 members as records started to accumulate. The need was identified for additional on-site research support to the independent panel, and for a dedicated project conservator, as the images in my last few slides have shown. And I should say that not all the records we received were in this poor condition. The images I've included are in the minority, but I've included them because they show some of the conservation issues that we've encountered. The workflow was also developed and honed for on-site processing. At the end of the pilot phase, it was estimated that a further 18 months at minimum would be required to complete the project. So we're now halfway through phase 3. 4 out of the 7 institutions that were originally surveyed have now deposited records, and that includes both of the religious orders. 2 organisations who hold their records for Northern Ireland in archive preservation standard repositories in the UK have agreed to enable access to their records by the independent panel research teams, and we feel that they're compliant with the Preservation of Documents Act. As the research progressed, additional records were also identified, gathered and digitised, such as church baptismal records for Catholic parishes where babies were baptised. Discussions are currently ongoing with additional record holders, such as the Sisters of Mercy, whose baby home in Newry, County Down, received infants born to mothers at nearby Marion Vale and other institutions. We're also negotiating access to records of the Mater Dei Hostel from Married Mothers with the Legion of Mary in Belfast. As a team and as an organisation, we place great importance on meaningful engagement with the individuals personally affected by this work to keep them informed of the work that we're doing. In February, an event took place in our office in Belfast with an option to attend virtually for those who couldn't attend in person. We hope to demonstrate our awareness of the extreme sensitivity of the information contained within these records and the importance that we place on protecting the privacy of those involved. As well as receiving a tour of the facilities, there was a question and answer session, which helped the team to gain much better understanding of the delegates' opinions and concerns. Feedback following the event was extremely positive. We've been told that our visitors were impressed with the care and attention that PRONI staff are taking in conserving and preserving records, which are so vitally important to them. They were also reassured by the positive engagement that PRONI had had with depositors and with the unexpected achievements relating to our gathering of records from some of the record holders. On the 22nd of May, the independent panel published an interim report providing information on the progress of the Truth Recovery programme. The PRONI work was front and centre of much of the media response to the report, which focused on the good news that over 3,000 items have now been preserved. This has motivated the team to keep up the good work and to secure more records for those who are personally affected. To date, we've learned to not assume anything. Organisations that we thought would be first to deposit haven't, and those we thought would be much harder to convince have cooperated much sooner than we expected. Also, we received many more records than were surveyed from more than one institution. Actively listening to understand, with impartiality, the opinions and perspectives of others has been really crucial. Our role as archivists is to preserve the records and the information they contain, not to be judgmental of anyone. Conservation, resource and support is required, but a balance needs to be struck between the length and the scheduling of a temporary deposit and the length of time it takes to carry out necessary interventive treatment. We've been using the approach of conservation stabilisation for handling and digitisation purposes rather than undertaking full interventive conservation treatments. Scrupulous quality assurance needs to be attended to. It can't be rushed or sampled. We want to make sure that the catalogue descriptions, the digitised images and their transcriptions, which form our data for indexing, are 100% accurate. We're mindful of those personally affected by the details in the records, and we are aware what a mistake might mean for someone. This helps us keep focused and determined to keep the quality as high as we possibly can. We also want to get the language right. We want to ensure we're not causing further trauma to anyone through our work. We'll have to carefully consider how to describe records in the catalogue, where non-acceptable language and terminology has been used in the past. The team and I recognise that we've still very much to learn on that. It's important that we're all supportive of one another as well within the team, and we're sensitive to noticing if anyone's feeling overwhelmed by the constant exposure to what is often emotionally challenging information. Team members can access more formal psychological support services if they require them. Back to Wesley now to conclude. Thank you.
This will be the last slide, you'll be glad to know. So as Joy was saying there are certainly many challenges that lie ahead. Northern Ireland, I know people may say it was a great example of what's been done. Good work has been done, but it's by no means straightforward, and we wouldn't want to leave you thinking that we've done it perfectly. Certainly we can learn from each other, and we have still major challenges to look at. And it may not be for PRONI, but certainly PRONI will be part of that conversation around some of the points we'll talk about. Certainly one of the issues that we'll look at is the scope of what's involved. Joy talked about the 4,500 original records that we looked at, but if the scope of the Truth Recovery Programme expands to include adoption records or records held by health trusts or children in care, then that could be tens of thousands of records potentially added to the 4,500. So again, it's small, it's discreet, but it's been achieved through face-to-face meetings rather than cold letters arriving in an institution and they don't know how to react. So that has helped to break down barriers and to let them know that we understand and we get it, that they're dealing with sensitive information and we treat it the same as they would if they had it. There's also the need for legislation as well, and whilst there is no compulsion on legislation-wise to allow or force private organisations to deposit their records with PRONI or any other body, certainly they have done this willingly so far, which has been a very good thing. And ultimately, the result has been that records have been preserved. That's the key thing. We are not lawyers. We are archivists in PRONI and records managers. We're here to preserve information and make sure it is secure and safe. So again, access to that information, the rights of victims and survivors versus researchers versus journalists and so on, all needs to be looked at. Local historians and so on. This is a bigger thing that we can cope with. So again, we will need to work with other departments and government and so on to examine the best way for access, and that could be working both with colleagues in the Republic as well, just to try and get a good working model. As Joy said, we're archivists. We're not social workers. We're not psychologists. And again, that can be quite challenging working with this and other material because of the nature of what it contains. There are lots of unanswered questions talking to colleagues about this, about what happened to those people. And we are human beings like you all, and we want to know what happened to that person, and that can be quite draining working on this material day and daily. Then finally, the other issue is the creation of an independent archive in Northern Ireland for this material, and the fact that that was part of the independent design report from 2021. Again, whilst we don't know PRONI doesn't know what that will look like, if even we will be part of that independent archive. What does independent mean? Does that mean independent from the state? Independent from the record creators? Who will decide on access and how will that look? So again, whilst we're not in the lead for that, our department, the executive office will lead on that development with other stakeholders feeding into it. PRONI will be part of that conversation and be there to advise on best practice from a preservation point of view and perhaps even access to information and how it's presented to those who apply for information. So again, hopefully that's been helpful. This example from Northern Ireland will be useful for others to learn from, to at least hear directly from those involved as to the progress that's been done to date, achieved to date over the last sort of 18 months. So thank you for listening, and